This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
All right, welcome into episode 94. This one is titled As the Stone Rolls. It's going to be a bit of a Blackstone gumbo, if you will. An audible stew of sorts. You know, it's not going to be consisting of seafood, sausage, peppers, and onions. It's definitely not going to have the okra. But little fact I learned recently, per official Louisiana Creole regulations, it does not have to have okra in it to qualify as a gumbo. It's highly encouraged, but you can still make gumbo without it. Today, we're going to be making a little gumbo of our own. It's going to be a little Q&A, a little rundown of current events, interesting samples, and of course, a dash of data. If you're listening to this on release day, it is July 3rd, so we're in the midst of a holiday week. That means we're trying to catch our breath because when there is a holiday and we're away from the office, you know, of course, that is a day when we are not analyzing samples, sending out reports. So in the remaining days of the week, it's kind of a frantic hustle and bustle to make sure that we are getting out the samples, reports in a timely manner, not allowing an overflow, getting the answers to you as quickly as possible. That's the objective, to make sure that we maintain a consistent rate of productivity, regardless of whether or not we're running into the holidays, because we know you need the answers as quickly as possible, and we don't have room for all of the samples in the world. It's not an infinite storage supply on the Blackstone campus, which means that we need to do our very best, not only for you, but for us, to make sure that we can keep the answers flowing out the door where they need to go. Now, speaking of trying to catch our breath, odds are good that you've heard or have had to deal with poor air quality recently. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, a customer had a very good question that I thought many of you might be wondering yourselves, and that is that when the air quality is poor, wherever you are, would that potentially have an impact on the engine that you're taking care of, whether it's in the air or on the road? And I think that is a great question that warrants an answer on this show. So, to answer this question, regardless of whether or not the air quality is poor, the air filter should be able to remove all significant particles in the air, but you do want to make sure to regularly check your air filtration setup. That means making sure the air filter is properly seated, making sure there's no cracks, leaks, loose connections, or fittings that could be allowing unfiltered air past the filter, reaching the crankcase, because that is, of course, when you'll run into problems. So be sure to regularly inspect your air filtration setup, especially when the air quality is poor. But, of course, that is part of regular maintenance, or at least it should be. When you're in the air, of course, it may be a good idea to limit the flight time to some extent when the air quality is poor. Of course, trying to maintain activity when at all safe. However, the number one thing you need to keep in mind is inspecting that air filtration setup, because if it is properly installed and you have no issues with the air filter, then it should be able to do the job of removing particles that are in the air, regardless of the air quality being poor. Your air filter should be up to snuff. Just to harken back to our most recent episode before this one, episode 92, featuring Justin and his Million Mile Accord. Appreciate all the listeners that have tuned into that episode, and especially any that offered feedback. Thank you as well to Justin for joining me on that episode. I had a great time chatting with him. If you have any similar stories as far as a ownership record where you were able to keep an engine on the road far beyond maybe even your wildest dreams, if you want to share any details about the maintenance plan, what you ran into, the adventures in doing so, or if you just have a good old story about how oil analysis helped you in your maintenance plan, don't hesitate to reach out either on social media, or you can call our voicemail line. That number is 614-407-6169. We'd love to feature you and your story, especially if you want to sit down with me and talk about maybe how oil analysis factored into your journey, questions about what oil analysis can tell you when you're trying to take care of the engine that you've got. We'd love to hear from you. So again, that voicemail number is 614-407-6169. You can also reach out on Facebook, Instagram, email. That email address is bstone@blackstone-labs.com. Another item that's been on the news recently, specifically in the Blackstone orbit, I brought up recently that we put out a reel on our Instagram about sampling without changing the oil and how I was surprised at the traffic that was flowing towards that reel recently. And of course, that has continued on, and I wanted to share some of the comments. Now, overall, it's been very positive, the response to that reel. And keep in mind, when we put out reels like that, we're never trying to convert someone per se into saying that like, hey, you need to change what you're doing with your maintenance plan. It's really more about, hey, did you know this is possible? If you're interested, holler at us. That's mainly what we're trying to do here when we have reels about, oh, sampling without changing your oil, or here's when to send in your oil, or here's how to package up the oil sample. Like, we're here to lend a helping hand if you're interested. But I think it's sometimes the case where people assume that we are trying to, in some way, shape, or form, tell them that what they're doing is wrong or something along those lines. So some of the comments that jumped out at me, these are somewhat paraphrases, amalgamations of several comments, but I boiled them down to a few reoccurring ideas I just want to address a little bit. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check out our Instagram. You'll see a reel. We're up to now, I think, like 26,000 views, which is kind of incredible for an account just focusing on the niche world of used oil analysis. So I love the traffic we've gotten on that. If you haven't checked it out, go look at it, come back to this show. And here are some of the comments that stood out to me. One of the first ones was a couple of users saying, just change it. Just change the oil. Don't worry about, going past the OLM when it hits zero and whatnot. I think that's kind of funny for a couple of reasons. So for those that don't know, oil life monitors are very conservative. They go by different factors than what we do in terms of, we want to know, is there active additive left? Where are the metals standing? What are the physical properties of the oil? All things that go beyond the OLM. So I think it's kind of funny when they say, the OLM hit zero, just change it. I'm like, hello. First of all, we're going by an entirely different cast of characters when we're deciding what the plot is here. And therefore, we want to know what this story is in terms of how's the engine wearing, how's the oil holding up, not merely being guided by, in some cases, a simple mileage-based switch. Not all of them, but there are some systems where it hits a certain amount of mileage, it tells you to change it, or it's a certain amount of calendar time. And this leads me into my favorite comment relating to this Instagram reel, where a user said, you should just change it every 6,000 miles or 6 months. And I'm like, okay, sampling without changing the oil applies to anything that needs oil to do its job. So imagine telling like an over the road, a trucker, someone in a long haul application, imagine telling them that, just change your oil every 6,000 miles. Are you serious? A lot of those engines are capable of going even 50,000 miles between oil changes. Some engines can get away with exorbitant amount of mileage and look fantastic. And the reason that people want to extend their intervals in many cases is because it saves money. And you can use the analysis to make sure you're not asking too much of the engine. But also calendar time. This is my favorite aspect of the response. Just change it every 6 months is what a couple people said. And I'm like, okay, if you take oil right out of the bottle and you put it in the engine, and say you're like my wife, for example, who went for a long stretch of time where she would only rack up, I believe, maybe 3,000 miles, no more than 5,000 miles, like every 6 to 12 months even. I mean, it was just very little driving overall, especially compared to what I do. Imagine telling someone, okay, you had a slowdown in terms of mileage. Okay, that oil's only been there 2,000 miles. Well, 6 months, you got to dump it out. Absolutely not. First of all, oil doesn't accumulate metal just by sitting in the sump. It only does so when it's doing the job of cleaning and lubricating the engine. So you honestly do not need to dump oil just based on calendar time. And if you do dump it just based on calendar time, no, you're not going to hurt anything, but that was good oil, likely, that could have stayed in use quite a bit longer. And of course, there are exceptions to the rule if you're talking about like vintage cars with open breathers where moisture can accumulate. Of course, there can be exceptions to the rule, but modern engines sealed up good and tight. You won't have moisture from the atmosphere. So changing it every 6 months is just unnecessary. Calendar time just isn't what you want to go by. You want to go by actual mileage. And when you get into the world of mileage, that varies so much depending on what you're asking the engine to do. Also, in some cases, you're going to want to go by hours. If you are, in an application where the engine's just doing a lot of idling, or, you need to track use that's not being recorded on the odometer. But again, it all comes back to use. And some engines handle that use better than others. And as such, oil change intervals can vary depending on what they're being asked to do. But again, this all just goes beyond this idea of when to change it simply by the OLM. I mean, sampling without changing the oil is a good thing to do if you're in a pre-buy situation and you're like wondering whether or not the last owner had oil in there that's still good to keep running. And of course, you're going to want to sample it and see where it stands. And obviously, you're going to want to check for serious problems like coolant or excess fuel. So a pre-buy context, it's a good idea to sample it. You don't necessarily need to dump it. And lastly, some folks would bring up the money side. They would say, oh, well, the cost of analysis is $35 for the standard analysis. You can change the oil for about the same price. And again, I think some people just have tunnel vision and they only think about the car they have, or they only think about the cheapest oil change possible. Because if you're a listener of this show and someone tried to tell you that an oil change is $35, some of you might be shaking your head and thinking, close. But then some of you might be going, are you kidding me? $35? That might get me halfway to actually doing the whole oil change, because depending on the brand or blend you're running, the price varies. And of course, depending on the sump capacity, you might be doing oil changes that are well outside that range. $35 might just get you in the door and thinking about doing the oil change, let alone actually doing it. So the whole idea of sampling without changing the oil, again, it goes for anything that needs oil to do its job. Of course, we filmed the reel in the context of my car because that's what's handy and it's applicable to many of you, because the bulk of our business are everyday folks trying to take care of their daily driver. However, it goes beyond the automotive world. It goes into industrial, where there's equipment that has, again, huge sump capacities. Changing the oil is a costly decision. So sampling is a good way to just see where it is. When you're dealing with very large systems that have a lot of oil in them, the key to saving money and the key to maintaining an effective maintenance plan is often taking that sample without changing it. So if you have a machine that needs oil to do its job, this practice can be very helpful. And so we just like to raise awareness to it and kind of dispel some of the misconceptions surrounding the practice itself or our promotion of it. And like I mentioned, if you haven't checked out this reel yet, just head over to our Instagram. And now a question that I recently fielded in my email inbox. This one came from a soon-to-be customer. They inquired about an oil analysis kit. They're from the UK. So they said, I can't get a kit because obviously I'm in the UK. So they wanted us to interpret some of their results that they got from another lab. And I wanted to let them know. I wanted to let all of you know, because we have listeners all over the world. And maybe you haven't thought of this yet. Maybe you just assume that Blackstone Laboratories, located here in Fort Wayne, Indiana, was just out of your reach simply due to the country you're in. That's not the case. We can send you a kit, whether you're from Taiwan or Tajikistan or anywhere in between. You can order a kit on our website. So just go to blackstone-labs.com. click on the link for a free test kit and we can send a kit to you. Now, the only downside about this is obviously you have to wait for the kit to be shipped from the US to wherever you are. And while it will get to you, you do need to pay for the return shipping because our free shipping labels are for use within the US. But you can get a kit, you can access our services, we can analyze your sample. It doesn't matter. As long as we can send the kit to you, as long as you have a mailing address, you'd be surprised. We've analyzed samples from any country you can name. So if you're looking to become a customer of Blackstone Laboratories, don't worry. If you're outside the US, we can send a kit your way and you can send it right back. Again, the only setback is you're paying for the return shipping, but that's it. Oil analysis can be yours, whether you're here, there, or anywhere with a mailing address. All right, now we're going to go behind the keys where I was looking at a sample from a 2011 WRX. This was the other day. This was a engine we had seen a few times. Of course, I'm talking about this particular engine. We've seen EJ25 samples. Oh, gosh. I would estimate conservatively, upwards of 14,000. I'm going to check that soon. But rest assured, we've seen the EJ25 a lot. Folks that are interested in used oil analysis, a large portion of those also just tend to be owners of cars such as these. So it was a sample from an EJ25. Like I said, we had a good track record of sample history from this particular owner. And that's really where things got interesting because this was an owner that was typically running T6 540, at least as far back as I could see on the page of samples I was looking at. And we had some interesting changes. So in this particular instance, I'm talking about a change in the additive package. This latest sample, again, it was noted as being T6, but I'll get into why I had my doubts. This latest sample, compared to all the previous T6 samples they had in the file, had a lot more molybdenum, a lot more magnesium, but it did not have as much calcium, boron, phosphorus, zinc that I was used to seeing. It had a little more iron too. And I'm going to get to the potential significance, I should say, of that result at the end here. So I was looking at this report and right away I knew something was amiss and I wasn't quite sure what that was. Per the slip, it was another sample of T6 and I'm thinking, all right, was there a clerical error at some point along the line? Well, we logged in the sample perfectly as per the slip. So what the customer wrote, we plugged that in for the oil type, the engine, the car, no notes on the slip that could potentially contradict what we had on file for this particular sample. So it was hard to say exactly what was going on straight away, but I knew that something was off. And this time I wondered if maybe the owner had maybe written the wrong car on the slip. Maybe they had a misprint on the oil type, something. But they didn't have any other unit in their file that looked like a possible alternative. So sometimes we have to speculate a little bit in the comment more than we would normally when we have to suss out a potential mishap because it's a delicate line to walk. You don't want to make accusations and you don't want to directly come out and say, hey, you made a mistake. That's not the right way to do things. You want to first ask if there was maybe a potential mix-up along the line. Was there more than one car being sampled at the same time? It's easy to mix the slips up sometimes if you're changing the oil on more than one vehicle, trying to fill out the slips, trying to make sure you don't make a mess with the kit. So you first want to approach those possibilities. And I mentioned in the comment, hey, it looks like this isn't the T6, that you're typically running. We're also seeing a little shift here in the wear pattern, a little more iron than usual. But at the end of the day, the good thing is I've seen enough samples from enough engines that these results were going to be good, pretty much no matter what. When you've looked at thousands and thousands of samples, even the differences amongst all the engine types that are out there, you still have a feel for metals and what looks scary, what looks normal, what looks low. There are going to be differences amongst the makes and models to be sure. And there's so much that goes into what looks normal on a per mile basis, a per hour basis, of course. But you still have an idea when you're looking at a lineup of what looks to be fairly casual from a wear standpoint. But nevertheless, we saw a little bit of a shift in the wear profile. Now, after I sent this report out, I was glad to hear back from the customer right away. I think pretty much the next day after we had sent the report out, they happened to reach out and let us know that the situation was that they couldn't find T6. And they forgot about the fact that when they went to go buy oil for this particular oil change where the sample was taken, they couldn't find T6, but there was Pennzoil. It was a 530. And would this account for the changes? And the answer is almost an emphatic yes. And I'll get to why it's not a full yes. It's almost all the way, though, because the viscosity was indeed in the 530 range. And the additives were more akin to Pennzoil. So we had reliable explanations for the viscosity not being a 540, for the additives not looking like T6. There's still something interesting going on with the iron level, though. It was a little bit higher than usual. And that's something we're going to keep an eye on. If you've listened to a lot of episodes of this show, then you've heard me talk about how we normally don't see a noticeable difference in wear when you just switch from one brand or blend to another. It's really more so about the operating conditions and how those shift, because a lot of the time people will forget to factor in the differences in operation, and they'll just want to focus on the oil type when accounting for a difference in how their engine is wearing. Now, I have not heard back yet on whether or not this oil run featured any differences in operation. So it's hasty to make any conclusions right now about whether or not the oil is directly responsible for these changes. But it is a situation I'm going to monitor. And what I mean by that is when the next sample comes in, if they're back to running 540 and there's been no difference in operation, significantly so, between these oil runs, then maybe we do have a case of the oil type having some impact on the wear profile. It's something we want to keep an eye on because you never say never when it comes to an oil type, a maintenance practice, something potentially having an impact. We just know that across the board, you don't see much of a difference when switching between brands or blends. Who knows? Perhaps we have an exception to the rule brewing. But the good news is we have an engine that's still doing well. We just have an interesting development to monitor. And that's the fun thing about oil analysis, is letting the numbers tell the tale and unpacking how the engine is doing oil change by oil change, keeping an eye on all of that. Because when it comes to oil analysis, it's not about simply reporting the numbers, but understanding what's behind them. And with that, it's closing time here in the Slick Talk studio. I want to thank you all for listening. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe if you like what you heard. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.